Laura Irwin, and today I'm going to be presenting my research entitled Between Sovereignty and Coordination, Reevaluating the Treaty of Peace, Harmony, and Mutual Assistance. Now, you might notice that the title has changed significantly since I originally submitted to the conference, but the artifact has remained the same and the argument the same in many general ways, but I wanted to refocus after doing a very deep diving full study. Now, the Treaty of Peace, Harmony, and Mutual Assistance was written and signed in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1967. Its signatories were members of Black and Chicano power organizations. The treaty was designed to reduce conflicts and tensions between Black and Chicano groups, while also establishing ways in which they could assist one another. While the treaty represents one of many attempts at cross-racial organizing during the civil rights era, it's relatively understudied, and historians who have evaluated the document have critiqued it and called it a failure of coalition because the signatories didn't form a long-term unification. While I agree that there are several limitations within the document, I argue it should not be critiqued for doing something that it was not designed to do, and that is unify or create a coalition. In this study, I conduct a close reading of the treaty to reevaluate it for what the signatories were actually trying to accomplish. They wanted to form a coordinated effort, not a coalition. Now, the differences between a coordinated effort and a coalition are subtle, but they play an important role in understanding this document. So, a coalition is formed when organizations or groups, and this is from a very interorganizational standpoint, it is when organizations or groups come together and are joined and united in their sort of structures and missions and actions. In a coalition, the collective, interdependent mission and group becomes the sort of more transcendent priority. A coordinated effort, on the other hand, is formed when organizations or groups are aligned to certain goals. In this effort, the organizations remain separate in their actions and missions, and the independence of each group is the priority, and there is no attempt to join or unite. So scholars who have read the treaty have, as an attempt at coalition, actually ignored the nuances and priorities of its authors and context, creating a misunderstanding and misjudging of the document. By reevaluating the treaty as a coordinated effort rather than a coalition, I make a more realistic analysis of the document to understand its strengths and weaknesses. A coordinated effort analysis recognizes the cultural and social context that influenced the rhetorical decisions that the signatories made. They weren't prepared to form a coalition, and the context reveals how and why. So let's get into the context. In 1967, the Alianza Federal de Mercedes, Federal Land Grant Alliance, a Chicano civil rights group, held their 5th annual convention in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, unlike their previous conventions that focused mainly on Chicano rights and needs, in this one, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, their leader, actually invited Black power groups to the convention to make connections and coordinate their respective civil rights effort that he identified as aligned. So there were nearly 400 attendees, and about 50 of them were members of different Black power movements, such as Black Panthers, Black Youth Congress, Congress of Racial Equity, Black Anti-Draft Unit, US Organization, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The convention created a unique environment for radical interaction and education between groups and established a sense of mutual aid and solidarity. Now, pictured here are 4 of the leaders that were in attendance. And they are actually 4 of the signatories that wrote and created and signed the treaty. At the end of the conference, Black and Chicano power leaders wrote and signed the Treaty of Peace, Harmony, and Mutual Assistance. Now, there are many reasons that the signatories of the treaty prioritize their sovereignty and weren't prepared for more interdependent organizing. Black and Chicano groups in the civil rights era were faced with a lot of obstacles to their organizing and attempts to work together, primarily due to the effects of white supremacy and racism. But there are 3 primary obstacles that come into play into this treaty that I'd like to discuss. The first is segregation, second competition, and then the black-white binary of the civil rights movement. Segregation, motivated and maintained by racism and white supremacy, kept Black and Chicano communities geographically separated from one another. and perpetuated ideas of incompatibility. Then, during Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, this perceived incompatibility led to competition, or perceived competition, over resources. There was this perception that there were only so many slices of the pie to go around, and some groups deserved more or less than others. For Black communities, the War on Poverty was a way to receive resources owed because of the civil rights, and the ever-growing Chicano community actually often was perceived as threatening those resources. And the Chicanos, on the other hand, saw the War on Poverty as another program enacted to ignore the needs of Chicanos. This is largely attributed to the fact that racist perceptions and intentions permeated throughout some of the ways that the groups interacted, largely due to geographic separation, but also because of white supremacy. Chicanos were often assimilated into whiteness, meaning that they were assumed to have white privilege. However, Chicanos often faced extreme discrimination and violence that was delegitimized because of this assimilation. And the Civil Rights era was the period in which Chicanos began to solidify their cultural identity and resist discrimination. At the same time, Mexican immigrants were often held racist conceptions and perceptions against Black Americans due to colorism and racism in Mexico, leading to further tensions and misconceptions between the groups, which led to them staying apart. And Black Americans as well sometimes held a lot of anti-immigrant conceptions against Chicanos and Mexican immigrants. Each of these tensions contributed to why racial civil rights groups during this period often sometimes prioritized their independence over working together. They wanted to ensure that their own communities were taken care of first, and concerns were secured before sometimes trying to extend into helping one another. This prioritization is indicative of the perception of competition and incompatibility rooted in racism and white supremacy, because they consistently saw their communities as separate. This backdrop of conflict not only catalyzed the treaty, but also motivated the signatories to write the treaty in a way that they could address some of these tensions. And I conducted a three-part analysis examining the interrelated rhetorical decisions of the signatories that they made when designing the treaty. So now jumping directly into the analysis. Now the first question a scholar of rhetoric might ask is, why a treaty? Why did they choose this specific genre? A treaty is most often used to settle international conflict or generate peaceful agreement between sovereign nation states. The signatories of the treaty weren't technically representatives in nation states, but instead were acting as such. This use of the genre is thus a metaphor. By using the treaty as a metaphor, Black and Chicano signatories emphasize their sovereignty to establish their self-determination and desire to remain independent of one another. The treaty metaphor, established both in the name of the document and its participation in the formal generic structure of the international agreement, allows the signatories to control how they are perceived as legitimate, separate entities and entering into a negotiated sort of settlement. So the language of the treaty indicates this. A lot of the times, most of the sections and articles of the treaty are started with the phrases both peoples or both races, as opposed to words like we or our or together, right? To indicate and establish that they want to remain separate, and they are these nation states who are coming together in an alignment. And I've selected two very particular examples from the treaty itself. In Article 4, Section A, they describe the right to send delegates to one another, and this language of emissary and delegation evokes international politics, and to organize certain communication practices between the groups, which emphasizes that they will not only remain separate, but that their interactions would be like those of diplomats visiting different nations while representing the interests of their own. And then the promises made in the treaty actually also contribute to our understandings of how conflict influenced this situation and its design. For example, in the example I have here, Article 1, Section C, they talk about promising that both peoples will not perpetuate false propaganda against one another, indicating that not only was this historically dividing behavior existing, but also that they were hoping to establish a framework to avoid this dividing behavior in the future, and also indicates the ways in which the signatories want to put an end to what they perceive as harmful actions that contributed to the conflict between these groups. Based on their inclusion in the treaty, it seems as though they're a form of ceasefire, outlining what they needed to stop doing to build trust and respect. The commitment to ending hateful and violent conflict reflects their transition into coordination because it allowed the signatories to employ a topos of mutual aid and draw on the familiar conceptual framework associated with it. This emphasis on mutual aid invoked the practices and ideologies of sociedades mutualistas, or mutual aid societies that predated this treaty. The influence of the mutualista movement is apparent in the treaty because of how the signatories perceive the ways in which each groups can support each other, and because of how they identified opportunities for support. So some examples that are from the treaty, they say that in the case of nuclear war, these peoples will promise to assist one another, right? So this section indicates that there are concerns, right? That they have these shared concerns that in the event of nuclear war, not only will they be left to their own devices, but non-white groups will need to come together. And also their imaginative construction of spaces in which they can actually assist one another. Another example of this mutual aid topos is in Article 3, Section A, where they actually commit to being able to generate mutual understanding by studying one another and their needs and their cultures and their beliefs. And this promise lies in their efforts to support and resolve conflict by creating greater understanding between the groups. They were both geared toward fighting white supremacy as their ultimate goal, and the needs of the respective groups remain different. By maintaining this degree of separation, the signatories seem to recognize that discrimination and racism they experienced occurred at a non-white minority level, but also had respective specific pan-Chicano, pan-Black levels as well. So mutual aid allowed the groups to operate kind of like train tracks, right? They're moving in parallel directions. They can maintain their sovereignty at the same time. And mutual aid, this topos, is used as kind of like the wooden slats that keep them going in the same direction as opposed to like veering off, right? So they were aligned, it's separate, parallel, yet not intersecting. So recognizing the contextual strengths and challenge of catering to multiple interests and perspectives that have historically been at odds, the signatories also employ strategic ambiguity within the language of the document to open the treaty to multiple interpretations and focus on the promise of mutual understanding while actually kind of postponing any discussion of the nuanced differences. Also, when employed by minoritized individuals, strategic ambiguity takes on an added significance as a subversive tactic. Disempowered individuals use ambiguity to resist hegemony by critiquing and combating the powerful in a way that won't run the risk of the powerful silencing them. So an example of this sort of language appears in Article 5, Section A, where they describe, again, that there will be a mutual understanding over, the activities and political events that will better the national status of the said peoples. The interesting thing about this is that actually national status is never defined, and they never indicate whether that status is shared or separate. Context is significant to understanding this language. They shared experiences with oppression could characterize their conceptualization of status, and both groups held preconceived notions of one another rooted in racist perceptions created by white supremacy that stratifies who is more or less deserving of rights in the U.S. And the black-white binary once again could indicate that because national status has been historically different and competitive, the signatories employ strategic ambiguity to avoid parsing out those nuances in the document that could actually be distracting to their coordination. Rather than highlighting differences in which these groups experience citizenship, privilege, and economic support, the signatories make a sweeping general statement about their status and how they hope to better said status. Another way in which strategic ambiguity occurs is in where they describe requiring official credentials to identify themselves. So it's a kind of a way to sort of implicitly acknowledge that they actually might be being surveilled in the conference and in the treaty as it's being created and written, right? In this section, they recognize that there might be undercover agents or government spies sent to infiltrate, which there were. And having credentials could help to prevent that, right? By postponing the naming of these credentials, they don't let their surveillors have access to their credential system. And the signatories use strategic ambiguity to not only resist surveillance, but also strengthen and support their individual actions through multiple interpretations. And this kind of also appears throughout the treaty in different sections as well, deploying that strategic ambiguity, like they know that they're being watched, and they're trying to be subversive in that hypervisibility. At the same time, I mentioned earlier that there are some limitations in the document, which I've identified as unproductive ambiguity. The signatories employ strategic ambiguity really well. Notwithstanding this, there are a couple of sections. I've identified one in particular that undermine their efforts and actually demonstrate an unproductive ambiguity. When used unproductively, ambiguity can create confusion regarding how groups may proceed or enact their goals, and because their explicit actions and follow-through is kind of unclear. Furthermore, ambiguity is unproductive when used to exclude or paper over perpetuations of hegemony. When used by the powerful, ambiguity can use to placate the marginal by engaging discourses that are indeterminate enough to keep them from rebelling. The signatories in this treaty actually enacted their male privilege to exclude women from the convention, or exclude women at the convention from participating in the writing and designing and signing of this treaty. Yet the language of the treaty is ambiguous enough in an attempt to placate so the marginalized and excluded members from critiquing or calling out that absence. And a way that this is done is throughout the whole treaty. Like I said, they mention that they speak very broadly. Both peoples, both groups do solemnly swear. It's very general, except for some very specific sections where they actually use he, him pronouns to indicate who exactly they're kind of thinking is going to carry out some of the actions, right? And so this section that I've identified, right, the emissaries and delegates and shall be identified by proper official credentials from his respective said people. Now this can be used as a sort of placeholder, but sort of applying our more modern understandings of pronoun usage can sort of help understand why these sort of action words separate and exclude further. In this way, they actually anticipated and expected the delegates to be men. They didn't perceive women as being involved in these procedures or an enactment of the treaty, and the patriarchal approach limits the possibility for coordination because not everyone is involved in enacting a coordinated effort, let alone represented. Unproductive ambiguity used to placate and subtly further marginalize members within its own communities weakens the scaffolding of the coordination because they enact the same yet nuanced dominance and oppression they're trying to resist. Now, two major lessons emerge from the treaty. One is coordination is especially useful for groups with tense or conflict-laden history to re-perceive one another and begin to develop a framework for understanding and communicating without imposing, compromising, or co-opting one another's needs and missions. And two, coordination requires a careful use of strategic ambiguity because while some ambiguity allows for flexible interpretations, unproductive ambiguity leads to exclusions and a weak foundation for creating realistic coordinated action or mobilization, as we see that how this treaty has slightly disappeared from civil rights history and eventually kind of fizzles out outside of the room where it was created and the convention and the space in which it was designed. Drawing these lessons from the treaty is a way to encourage further current and future activists and scholars to not only stand on the shoulders of these giants and recognize how a framework for cross-racial coordination not only exists, but offers a scaffolding in which to develop their own relationships built on a history of past support. And additionally, drawing from the past helps ensure that the same mistakes will not be repeated in the present. This project is a way to honor and validate the legacy of change those previous activists created, while also drawing on their experiences to influence and create a better future. Thank you very much.